Welcome back to episode number 20 of the Phyba Performance Podcast. We have a really special guest on. Maddie Legg and I have wanted to have Bill on for such a long time, and this has been about 2 months in the workings. But Matt has spoken so highly of Bill over the last probably half a year and has been telling me all the cool things he's been researching. So, Bill, thank you so much for coming on the Phyba Performance Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, for having me on.
Great. Awesome. Well, I think we'll rip straight into some cool stuff. Maddie, you've been talking about Bill and all the cool stuff that he's been researching over the last however long. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to have Bill come on to the podcast?
Couple of reasons. I've done some podcasts with Bill before, and they're always mind-blowing for me. I love them. Bill, in my opinion, is one of the experts in the world regarding protein. And how much protein to have at different stages of our life, for different objectives, when we're dieting, when we're bulking up, when we're trying to lose some weight and that sort of stuff. When you want to talk to someone about grams per kilo body weight and how much protein we need or when do we need it, Bill's the man. So while we've just launched ourselves out a plant-based protein, what we wanted to do is we get questions all the time from people about, why do I need protein? When should I take protein? How much protein do I need? How much protein is too much? So I figured that these are the sort of questions that Bill can pretty well nail as the world's expert.
Well, and that's super interesting because Bill and I just had a conversation before we jumped online, and he was asking, so what sports did you do? And I was just like, well, there's this one and this one and this one and this one. So let's just rip right into that, Bill. In terms of your experience and what you've been looking at, for someone with a diverse background, kind of like myself here, how much protein, what information do you need to know to try and work out what type of protein I would need as an athlete?
Yes, I like to start with just the philosophy of why we need protein. So
Great.
I have termed protein as the adaptive nutrient. So for any athlete or anybody that wants to train and they're trying to change their body or enhance their performance, you train, and that training provides a stimulus for your body. So we fuel that training, and for fueling the training, we think of carbs and fats. Those are our fueling nutrients. But protein is unique in that it's the adaptive nutrient. Protein allows your body to adapt to that training stimulus. And it really doesn't matter what you're trying to improve. If you're trying to build muscle, protein. You're trying to be more explosive, protein. Stronger, protein. Protein, that's our cells' DNA, that's what they will make. So you need to give the body the tools or the materials to be able to form the enzymes, the cellular matrix, the protein if it's skeletal muscle, all of those materials to adapt to the stimulus. So we start there. So it's not really, you can have all the carbs and all the fat you want. You're not going to adapt to your training with them. Now, they're the best for fueling. And and related to that, protein's a horrible fueling nutrient. If you had to fuel your exercise with protein, you would be lacking in energy. The body doesn't break it down quickly or efficiently. So starting with that. Now, where do we want to go from there?
From there, that's super interesting in itself. From there, if I was to say, would you be allocating different amounts of protein for someone who is competing in, say, a powerlifting sport like powerlifting or Olympic lifting, to someone who is in the endurance space doing marathons and long distance Ironmans? Are they two different? Do you go about it in two different ways?
I tend not to differentiate much. And again, that goes back to the philosophy that I just shared. Both of those athletes are clearly on opposite ends of the performance spectrum, the endurance extreme and the power or strength extreme. But regardless, they both train and train seriously because they want their bodies to adapt. So from that sense, they both need protein and more than what the typical medical establishment would suggest we need. Now, if I were going to say they need the same, I would think a strength-based athlete could use more, since that's more of a strength-based adaptation, but they still both need it. And I personally, not based on research, just my own recommendation, if I were to work with those athletes, I would probably start them on about the same amount. And that would be somewhere in the range of 1.6 up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And one thing about our endurance athlete, they are traditionally, their thinking has been almost too obsessed with carbohydrates. Now, of course, they need carbohydrates. Depending on some of them can get away depending on what type of endurance athlete they are with a ketogenic diet, but it had to be very low intensity. But those athletes tend to not value protein as much as what they should. So I would actually spend more time on educating and following up if I were counseling that type of athlete who's an endurance athlete, because they need to recover. I mean, they have a ton of volume in their training, and they need to recover from that.
Yeah. And this has been a question that has been put to us a couple of times in the past. Let's say that you have someone who's, say, going off the 1.6 to 2.2 per kilo of body weight. Let's say you had someone who was, say, 130 kilos, 140 kilos, but they weren't muscular. Say they were fat. Would you still have them on that range as well if they were looking to decrease weight, but they still wanted to do some weight training at the same time, but they wanted to, obviously lose a bit of fat? Would you still be putting them on, say, that 1.6, or would it be more based around lean body mass?
So I would not have that type of individual. If somebody has obesity, or if they're overweight, what I tend to do is say, what is your goal weight? And we would base the protein on their goal body weight, or what you just said, a very common approach, if they know their lean body mass, you could also base it on that. So what I just said there doesn't necessarily apply to that population. And that's probably something I should have said earlier. The type of athletes I work with are almost all physique athletes or serious fitness enthusiasts, people who are pretty serious. So I don't typically work with an obese or overweight population.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. It's one thing that I've always wanted to find out about, because people ask me all the time, and I'm just like, well, it really kind of depends on, I guess, the population, right? That's super interesting.
And what about the timing? The other question we get asked all the time is, what's the best time to take protein? And does it matter? Is there a maximal dose that you can have at any one time? I remember it used to be always 30 grams of protein was a story at one stage. How about that?
So let me address your timing question, because I know that every athlete wants to know that. So if we can separate a physique athlete, somebody who's trying to build muscle, look like they're very lean, have low levels of body fat, and separate that from somebody like James, who actually needs to perform for their career, or they're an athlete. I'm saying bodybuilders aren't athletes. For the bodybuilder or the physique-minded individual, the timing isn't all that important. What's most important is your total daily protein intake, and then dividing that approximately over 3 to 5 protein feedings per day. And ideally, those are approximately equal protein boluses throughout the day. Now, for the athlete, we have limited data that it is more important that they get their protein and carbs. So the research that I'm relying on as I'm talking about this, that research gives them protein and carbs immediately after their training or their competition. And that data suggests that over time, they actually have significant improvements in performance. So it seems like if you're just resistance training, the need to do it immediately after is not essential. If you're an athlete and your goal is some type of athletic performance, it seems like it's more important to get it immediately after. Now, that being said, I don't differentiate. I instruct athletes or anybody that I'm working with, you're going to eat protein anyway. So let's go ahead and plan for one of them to be your in post workout, because otherwise you might be going out of your way to not get it after a workout. So not as important for a physique athlete, more important for a sport athlete. And then let's go back into the question of how much can our body take at one time? How much can we ingest or utilize? And like you, Matt, I've often heard 20 or 30 grams And that's not true. I like to answer it kind of like a jerk. Like if you eat 1,000 grams, your body's going to digest it. So it's not that your body can't digest it. What I think most people mean when they say there's a limit to how much we can take in, they're referring to something, the outcome of muscle protein synthesis. So that's a cellular response or a cellular process where you're building up skeletal protein in your muscles. Now, there is a limit on how much you can ingest in one meal and get that outcome. And that the way that works is on a per meal basis or a per protein feeding basis. The more and more you take, the more and more you ingest. So as you go from 20 to 30 grams to 40 grams to 50 to 80 to 100 grams, you get less and less of a benefit with the more you take. But there's still an added benefit. But after 30, 40, 50 grams, depending on the size of the person, the benefit becomes fairly negligible. So just think of a curve that gets flatter and flatter. So 20 is a lot better than 10. 30 is better than 20. 40 might be a little bit better than 30. 50 is marginally better. So you see what I'm saying? So there is a limit at some point on muscle protein synthesis. A lot of people, though, fail to recognize protein also has an effect on muscle protein breakdown, and that would suppress muscle protein breakdown. So there's that benefit as well, which a lot of people don't even consider. So that's why when I give protein recommendations up to about 2.2 grams per kg, that seems pretty high to a lot of people. And I just say, well, don't just focus on muscle protein synthesis. We also have to appreciate muscle protein breakdown. But I also say for people that struggle to get that much in a day, I say, well, remember, if you can get 1.6 or 1.7, you're still getting a lot of the benefit. Going to 2.2, the benefit is not as much. Where we really see the best adaptations is when somebody starts off low and we increase it to even up to 1.6. I've seen body transformations with just that change.
That is super cool. And I think I'm probably about around the 1.6, 1.7 mark myself on average. Well, one thing I was going to ask is protein sources. What have you found in your experience are, just the best protein sources just for getting, a great combination of amino acids that we need to do this type of work, protein synthesis, enzymes, that type of stuff?
So typically you want to make sure that the protein source that you have, that it has enough leucine. So that's one of the essential amino acids. Leucine there's approximately 20 amino acids. And out of the 20, about half of them, 8 or 9 of them, are considered essential amino acids, which means we have to get them from the diet, from our food sources. Leucine is unique among all of the other amino acids. That is the one that that basically turns on. It's like a light switch. It literally turns on the muscle protein synthetic pathway. And again, it's very unique to leucine. The other amino acids don't have that. So if you look at it from that perspective, you choose your sources that have high leucine. Now, traditionally, that have been animal sources tend to be the highest in leucine. But if you choose a plant-based or vegetable-based protein source, what we've learned is you might just need a little bit more total protein to meet what we call this leucine threshold. So animal sources, you get more protein you get more leucine, more essential amino acids with less volume. Let's just say a scoop let's just say for argument here, 1 scoop. Or if you're getting plant-based protein, maybe you need 1.2 scoops to get the same amount of leucine in that bolus, or the same amount of all of the essential amino acids.
Interesting. I love that.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to ask is, again, calories in, calories out. We talk about that for fat loss or any form of adaptation, whether you want to get bigger or smaller. Bill does some crazy quizzes and stuff. If you have to, anyone here follow Bill on social media, he does these quizzes all the time, and I get most of them wrong. Just so if you're reading the quizzes and Yeah, they're like trick questions, I'm sure of it. One of the things I noticed, it's almost like calories in and calories out determines if you're going to lose weight. You've got to be in that calorie deficit, except for protein. There's a little bit of a trick there. I've noticed some of the themes there that they can have a little bit extra protein. Doesn't seem to have the same effect as other macronutrients with it while they're in a fat loss journey.
Yeah, so my take on this, which is, I guess some people would call it a little bit controversial, but I make the statement that you're not going to get fat eating protein. It's very hard. I'm not aware of any study where subjects, when they're fed extra protein, and that means protein alone, so we're not talking about protein plus carbs plus fat. When you have a resistance trained subject, and I think there's 3 studies that I'm referring to here. One of them's one of my own studies. But when they overfeed resistance training people on protein, they do not get fat. 2 things happen. They either maintain their current level of body fat, or in some cases, they actually lose body fat, which is odd because, again, we're taught that if you increase calories, you should gain body weight. And likewise, when you decrease calories, you should lose body weight. And by the way, I'm an advocate of what we would call the energy balance model for fat loss. So calories in, calories out. But there is a unique nutrient of protein that just messes things up a little bit. It doesn't make it so cut and dry.
And why do you think that is, Bill? Is that part of the fact that maybe that particular calorie might modify the calorie out? Does it do something to increase calorie burn, or is it? What are your theories around why that happens?
So what I think is happening is protein is the only macronutrient that has nitrogen. So we have these nitrogen bonds, and as we digest protein, the peptide bonds, they're hard to break. It takes more energy for the body to break apart these nitrogen bonds, and that releases more energy. Plus, muscle protein synthesis, which we've been talking a lot about, that's a very energetically demanding process. So if you're feeding yourself protein, 1, we're expending energy to break it down, to digest and absorb it. 2, we're going to have an acute bout of muscle protein synthesis. That also causes an increase in energy expenditure. So those 2 things alone, I think, are the likely reasons for why protein tends to just be more energetically demanding on our body. Takes more calories to change. I'll tell you about one study. They took what were they? They were females who were normal weight obesity. So these were females that were not, their body weights were not high, but they had very high levels of body fat. Some people call it skinny fat. And what they did with these females, they divided them into 2 groups. And in the one group, they just increased their protein. Increased protein, reduced carbs by the same amount. Didn't have them diet at all. Didn't increase their calories, didn't decrease their calories. The other group kept eating low protein. And what happened was they significantly increased their skeletal muscle mass and decreased their fat mass. And they weren't exercising. So just changing the protein composition of their diet, I think they were going from like 1.1 to 1.8. That's all it took. And that's a pretty powerful outcome. And I do want to go back. Calories in, calories out. I'm doing some work on that right now. That works. That's not to say that some people do struggle with weight loss when they're controlling their calories, but by far that's the exception. That is not the rule. You take 100 people and reduce their calories, 99 of them are going to lose body fat.
That's so interesting. Have you noticed, or have you seen, and I know that you're running a little bit pressed for time, have you noticed any really adverse effects from over-consuming protein, something that is maybe bad for us long term? Is it, does it wreak havoc anywhere else if we over-consume protein? Let's say we went up to, say, 3 grams per kilo of lean body mass.
I'll answer that by saying I'm not aware of any research reporting that. I know there's been 2 studies where they had 3.3 grams per kg for months, and another study 4.4 grams per kg for months. In both studies, there was blood work, clinical markers of health, no adverse effects. Now, I do appreciate the question, and here's what I say, because obviously my protein recommendations tend to be a little higher than others. And the last thing I want to do is give somebody advice that's potentially harmful. That I would feel horrible about that. So one thing that I do is in my classes, when I tell my students, hey, here's my protein recommendation, but on the first day of my class, whether it's a sports nutrition class or a weight management class, I say, if you can bring me one study that reports an unhealthy outcome from high protein intakes in healthy people, so we're not talking about people with end-stage renal disease or metabolic disease. So in healthy people eating high protein diets, you're done for the semester. You get an A, and you've earned an A by giving me that data. And no student in 10 years since I've been doing that has been able to do that. Now, there are some correlation studies, but that's not what I mean. As you guys know, correlation, you can correlate anything to make your case. So I make it be an intervention-based study, because the last thing I want to do is recommend something that could be harmful for people. And I need to mention this again. My recommendations are for healthy individuals, and particularly people that are exercising.
That is super fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, it is.
Mate, how are you going for time?
About 10 more minutes, if that's all right.
Oh, great.
Oh,
Because
beautiful.
I got another question. Diane, I hit you with all these questions. You mentioned earlier calories in, calories out again. The calorie expenditure, now correct me with these stats because they're just coming off the top of my head and you're much better at memorizing these things than myself. But the actual calorie expenditure from exercise in the average population, something like 0 to 5% or something. But then the thermic effects of foods, where you mentioned before the ability to digest the protein and stuff, there's a lot of is it 20 to 30% of your potential daily calorie burn can be the thermic effects of foods by your food choices and how hard they are to digest and break down?
Yes. Yep. That's exactly right. So that's funny. You said I'm good with numbers. I'm horrible at memorizing numbers, but I do remember these numbers. Your thermic effect of fat is 2%. Your thermic effect of carbs is about 7%, and your thermic effect of protein is about 25%. Let's just explain what that means. If I were to have 100 calories of fat, so let's say some butter, I just get some butter and I start eating butter, and it's 100 calories. It takes the body some energy to digest and absorb that butter, but fat is very low. It only takes like 2 extra calories. So if I eat 100 calories worth of fat, it will take 2 calories of energy to digest and absorb it. So I'm really only getting a net increase of 98 calories. Now let's look at carbs. Let's say it's 100 calories of carbs, pasta. If I eat 100 calories, it's going to take 7 of those calories to digest and absorb it. Now protein, if I have 100 calories of protein, about 25 of those calories are needed in the form of energy to digest and absorb it, which we mentioned earlier. It goes back to that nitrogen bond and muscle protein synthesis. There's a large metabolic advantage or a thermic effect of protein that's significantly greater than carbs and fat, which goes back to our argument that it's a lot harder to overeat on protein and gain body fat as compared to fat and carbs. Very easy to do with fat.
That's super. Yeah. I didn't know that at all.
Even the exercise bit, the fact across the average, I think it's like 0 because some people do no exercise, up to like 5 or 9% or something like that. I think that it capped out around there. For some of these elite athletes, it's still only that exercise that they're putting in is only contributing that much of the potential shift in calorie burn. So which gives people out there, the general population, a massive opportunity to actually manipulate the calories from their macronutrients when they want to create a calorie deficit or a calorie excess.
Yeah. And have you seen any studies on the amount of energy required? Is it more like Matt was saying, 10% or less probably goes towards the exercise. Some of it goes towards actually digesting the nutrients. But in terms of recovery, is more of the calorie burn in a person from the recovery aspects from that 10% or less exercise that we're doing, just sitting back, sitting on the couch trying to recover from
the afterburn.
The afterburn, yeah. Do you know many stats on that? What type of requirements are there, or is that the highest point?
Well, your recovery in terms of energy recovery is really going to be dependent on the intensity and the duration of your exercise bout. So that's going to be highly variable from one person to another. Now, CrossFitter, that would be pretty extreme. I mean, that's very intense for depending on the event for long periods of time. So there's going to be quite a lot of what we call just post-exercise oxygen consumption, or just the amount of calories you're burning for recovery during that phase.
Yeah, interesting. And I wanted to touch on, and I love this topic so much, and Matt's fired me up about this topic so much more, creatine. I want to know a little bit more about the creatine aspect. And for a lot of people, especially when they ask me as a plant-based athlete myself, what does my supplement regime look like? And I always recommend getting in some creatine, especially being plant-based. Like, it's always, if you're going to add one thing in, probably add this in. It's probably going to do you some benefit. Have you noticed anything that is just, astronomically cool about creatine that we may not know about, or something that you can reinforce that is a really cool thing about creatine monohydrate or any other form?
Yeah. Well, give me 1 second. You guys know I'm traveling tonight, so
Let's go.
Here's my creatine that I'm traveling with me tonight. So I don't leave home without it. I'll say this that may be new. So creatine, I give it to my children in their fruit smoothies. They don't know they're getting it, but it's tasteless. We know that it increases strength. We know that it increases muscle mass, unless you're a non-responder. So if you're a type 1 muscle fiber dominant athlete, like a marathon runner, you don't get much benefit from it. But and the area that I'm not an expert in, but the health benefits are becoming just mind-boggling. So stroke recovery, prevention of concussions. There's something called a get up and go test for frail elderly people. Autism, there's some research in autism. So there's all of these clinical health benefits of a supplement that I just looked at it for its sports for its sports performance outcomes. So again, I can't sit here and talk about this study and that study, other than to say creatine is so much more valuable. And again, I feel you might think that I'm paid by the creatine industry. I'm not. I don't make any money from it, but it's one of those supplements that's relatively cheap. I know the price has gone up recently with supply chain issues, but it's not just a performance supplement. It is also a health supplement.
Wow. And is there any particular form? I guess maybe are we talking just a creatine monohydrate, or is there something else that you know about that's No,
creatine monohydrate. It's like 99% bioavailable. So anybody who claims that another form is better, it's hard to improve on 99% bioavailability.
Totally.
If you consume too much, you're urinated out. So there's a limit on that. So I just take a teaspoon almost every day, and I just I'll do that until I'm dead.
Yeah, I'm about the same.
And with stability of creatine, I mean, it's got to be in a powder and added and then drunk pretty much straight away. You can't go and put it into a drink and have it sit there. It does convert through and
correct.
And
yes.
Then,
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. When I was in grad school, I was in a study that ended up in litigation because they put their creatine in a liquid medium and then made all these claims, but there was no creatine in it by the time the consumer consumed it.
Yeah, and on the blood test when they do with the doctors and they measure this thing called creatinine, and a lot of people think that creatine causes kidney problems because they confuse it with the word creatinine. So did you want to explain to people that that's pretty much just what happens when you put it into the liquid, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just it's a normal byproduct, a metabolite of creatine. And like you said, a lot of people they'll or even a lot. If you exercise intensely, you'll have a lot of something called creatine kinase in your blood, which is an enzyme. So that's indicative of a heart attack in some people, but it's just natural. Again, I'm just going to pick on CrossFit athletes. They train so intensely. Their creatine kinase levels, which is an enzyme, it leaks from the skeletal muscle, that can be high in the blood. Now, again, that can be dangerously high, but a medical professional who's not trained may look at that or creatinine and not know, well, this is a little bit more natural for people who are exercising or supplementing with creatine. And hey, I do got to run it.
Yeah, no, you're good, mate. That's perfect. Well, let's wrap it up. Well, Bill, thank you so much for coming on. Maddie and I have just I've had my mind blown. This is probably a lot of what Matt has talked about with you in the past, but we really appreciate you coming on, and we'd love to have you back on to talk shop, and especially about all the cool things that are coming up for you too. I know there's a few things in the works there, so that'd be really good to, readdress and get back to.
Yes, yeah. And if you guys can remind me, email me and I'll send you some of my issues of my research review, just so you can take a look at it.
Great.
Oh, yeah.
We'd love that. Awesome. Well, mate, thanks so much for coming on, and safe travels.
Yes, thank you guys. Thanks for bearing with my mistake all the time.
All good. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah,
bye.
See ya.
Thanks, Bill. You're a legend. I can love everything you do, man.
Thanks, man.
There you go. I know you can't hold up, but man, thank you so much, and we'll definitely catch up with you soon.
All right, sounds good. See ya.
See you, buddy. Bye. Genius, that guy, eh? But the way he just knows it, like, you can just ask him anything and he knows it.